Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar hosted by Santa Massimo Davis, Outside General Counsel Solutions. It's entitled How to Develop a Return to Work Plan and Manage Employees Through COVID-19. I'm one of your hosts, Chris Santa Massimo, a partner at the firm. And again, thank you very much for joining us today. You know, COVID-19, no doubt, is perhaps the biggest issue in the news these days, both on the personal side as well as in the business pages. It really impacts virtually every facet of how we run businesses. And I think what we find with our clients now is that they're having some difficulty figuring out next steps. Everybody successfully pivoted or did their best to pivot to a return to a remote working environment. But now, because of a patchwork of state regulations and local regulations and executive orders, it's a little bit unclear to folks, how they can return to work, when they can do it, and how can they provide a safe workplace for their employees. On top of that, and we'll cover these today, but many of the rules that we're used to in terms of how we manage our employees have changed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're going to talk about all those issues and hopefully create a dialogue among the group in terms of the issues that you're going to face as you develop your plan, as you manage your employees, both today and into the future as we try and turn a corner and come out of the pandemic. There's a chat function in Zoom that will allow you to post any questions that you have. So we'll do our best to try and reach those questions. Some of the questions may be covered later in the presentation. So if that's the case, we'll sort of put those on hold. We'll address as many as we can. And in some cases, if there's a detailed question, we're going to invite you to reach out to us and schedule, or we may reach out to you rather and schedule an appointment just to have a call about it and answer the questions that you have. But we'll do the best we can to cover as much as we can during today's webinar. Here's the agenda for today. We'll just talk a little bit about our firm just to give you a sense for how we approach this issue and where we're seeing these issues. You're going to hear the word flexibility many times through the webinar today. So that's going to be one of our catchwords, if you will. Shutdowns and slowdowns, talking about layoffs and plant shutdowns or slowdowns in some cases, the elements of a return to work plan, how to protect employees and provide them with a safe workplace, how to respond to a COVID-19 case when it arises in your workplace, managing remote employees, and then confidentiality and cybersecurity risks. Just a bit about our firm. So we are a specialty firm of 16 lawyers, and we come to market with the outside general counsel solution for mid-market companies. What we find is that companies that have complex needs, repetitive needs for legal services, but aren't large enough to hire their own captive law department, find themselves in a place where they're not getting the services that they need at the price they need. We've tried to bridge that gap by providing our firm as an outsourced legal department, in a sense, your outside general counsel solution that can handle all of your legal needs and perhaps do it on a fixed fee to enable you to basically get the benefit of what it's like to have an in-house law department, but perhaps at a fraction of the cost that your company may be used to paying to go out and buy legal services on an hourly basis. So in the course of that work, we become very close to clients because we sit at the table with management teams as they go through not only legal issues, but also regulatory issues and come up with business solutions to business problems. So in the course of that work, we partner with HR, the human resources team, as well as the executive team at these companies to develop the kind of plans that we're going to talk about today. So really the issues that we're talking about today are ripped from the headlines, if you will. They come right from our direct experience working for clients in the mid-market space. And those clients are a variety of manufacturing companies, service companies, companies with administrative functions. So we really get to see all facets of their businesses. And so the things we're going to talk about today really are applicable across the board. As I said at the beginning of our discussion today, flexibility is what I really want to highlight. As we get experienced in business, we become maybe a little bit rigid sometimes in terms of how we like to manage the business, or we have certain norms that we come to observe. COVID-19, if it teaches us anything, it teaches us how flexibility is really important. That is flexibility in terms of how we manage our workforce, flexibility in terms of what we expect from the employees on our teams. Rather than stretching ourselves to stick with those old norms that may not necessarily be so applicable anymore, or at least during the pandemic, they're not applicable. What we tell clients is, rather than trying to stick to the old norms, let's worry about how do we get the business done? How do we manage employees in a remote work environment? How do we, how do we get business done despite the challenges ahead of us? So I would tell folks that are running businesses to come to the table with an open mind, to really think about, do I need to manage employees in the same manner that I did before? Those notions about, evaluating employee performance are not necessarily applicable, or they could be changed. So don't necessarily expect that those norms are going to work anymore. Think about, what is my objective? How do I reach it? How do I avoid stepping in a pothole when it comes to these new requirements about how people work and how they get managed? And then also, it's great that folks pivoted to a remote work environment in many cases. And I think that shows some flexibility, and has probably created a new extension of the workplace in many cases. Folks that weren't providing a remote work option all of a sudden had to, right? So it's not just about location anymore. I also think it's about accommodating employees who now have other challenges at home, with students who are trying to learn in a remote environment, other family responsibilities that have to get done during 9 to 5. Think about flexibility, not only in terms of location, but in terms of timing. When are people getting their work done? Maybe you're going to find that folks are going to have to spend their 8 hours or 10 hours a day working early in the morning and late at night, so they can be available for children and some elder care issues during the normal workday. So approach all these things with flexibility as best you can. And I think it's going to pay dividends, because employees, I think, will appreciate it as well. So shutdowns and slowdowns, unfortunately, many employers have had to lay off employees, or at least furlough employees. That is a temporary layoff. I just want to give you a couple of reminders here about some things that may apply to your particular company. Whenever you're going to do a layoff, whether it's a furlough, that is a temporary layoff, or a permanent layoff, it's really important that you do a bit of a risk assessment, preferably with your legal counsel and your human resources team, to understand whether there's going to be a disparate impact because of the layoff. You have to be able to demonstrate, I think, that you made decisions about who to lay off, when to do the layoff in a non-discriminatory manner. And the best way to do that is to be able to document how you made your decisions, who was chosen, and why were they chosen. Because we haven't seen a ton of litigation around this just yet, but I do anticipate that, like any situation in which people lose their employment, you should be ready for a possible discrimination charge later on. So we want to be able to document that as best we can, and also do a risk analysis. We sit down with the human resources teams of our clients to do exactly that whenever there's even a single layoff, just to be sure that we've fully documented the situation and understand how the decision was made. It's going to pay you dividends later in terms of defending a potential claim. You also have to look at whether there's a WARN Act trigger. That is, if you're going to lay off enough people to trigger the WARN Act, either at the federal level or in some cases at the state level. Many states have what's called a mini WARN. They have their own version at the state level of the WARN Act. So whenever you're going to do a mass layoff or a plant shutdown, you should evaluate whether there's a WARN trigger. And sometimes, if you've been laying people off periodically over, say, a 12-month period before your latest layoff, you may actually have a rolling WARN trigger. So again, I just want to highlight it. We're not going to be able to cover all of the facets of it today, but I just want to make sure that folks are at least sensitive to the fact you may have a trigger, and that's going to determine how much notice that you give to your employees about the layoff. All right. And also, like as in the state of New Jersey, it may actually require you to pay severance to certain employees if you don't give the proper amount of notice. So the elements of a return to work plan. First of all, I think it's really important to know your state and local requirements. I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that what we're facing is a patchwork quilt of state and local executive orders and pronouncements in some cases. So you want to know which ones apply to your company. They vary a lot state to state, locality to locality. So you got to be very aware of what applies to your business. and sometimes they don't fit together that well. So just know what they are. Um, but what I think is going to be applicable across the board is the need to implement CDC's safety and hygiene practices. That's the Center for Disease Control, in case someone doesn't know what it means. But CDC, we've seen a lot of in the news, as you know, during the pandemic, and uh, there are safety and hygiene practices, including the use of personal protective equipment, social distancing or separation, the idea that employees are going to stay as separate as they can, at least 6 feet apart from each other. And in some cases, depending on the nature of your environment, you may be required to have your employees use PPE, and the employer should be prepared to provide that PPE. You know, for some clients, they've actually taken the additional step of tried to, and this is something we would recommend, is to poll their employees each day in terms of whether they've experienced any symptoms of COVID-19 or whether they've been exposed to somebody who is positive. What you want to have your employees do is be able to certify that they're not either COVID positive, not experiencing any symptoms, and also haven't been exposed to anybody who is COVID positive or experiencing symptoms. That is before they come to the workplace. All right. If you're going to bring your employees back, you want to be prepared to de-densify any dense workspaces. You know, as I said a moment ago, the CDC is advising that employees should remain at least 6 feet apart during the workday. If you've got a situation in which people are stacked up pretty tightly in your workplace, you're going to want to de-densify. This would be the time to sit down with your furniture supplier and plan your workplace. You know, what was okay before COVID is not necessarily okay anymore. And that could mean a reconfiguration of your work environment. It could be installation of some other barriers and dividers that would enable you to keep people as apart and separate as you possibly can. You have to have in place a plan for what happens when someone does become COVID positive. So typically a plan like that is going to involve a couple of elements. Number one, if someone is COVID positive and they have been in your workplace, if they're in your workplace at the time you learned about the positive diagnosis, they need to be quarantined and then basically required to leave your workplace and separated from anybody else that's in the workplace at the time. Secondly, you should be prepared to consider sending home your workforce, as well as letting everyone else in the workspace know that there's been a COVID positive case, so that they can consider quarantining in some cases, right? And then lastly, you should have a plan in place that includes some cleaning of the workplace to basically implement the CDC's hygiene practices. You know, not only do you want to provide a safe workplace, but you want to be able to assure your other workers that the workplace is as safe as possible, so that they will eventually feel comfortable coming back to the workplace. And as I mentioned before, there's a lot of new requirements, and we're going to spend some time talking about some of the new developments in terms of how you manage your employees. So it's not the same as it was before in all cases. Documenting your transitions is important. You know, the things that I was talking about on the prior slide in terms of having your plan, what you're going to do to implement the CDC's hygiene practices. I highly recommend that everybody document what you did and when you did it. It's going to be really important in terms of defending a possible claim later that you didn't provide a safe workplace, or if you've got to make a report to OSHA. I think you want to be able to demonstrate that you did everything that you could to make the workplace as safe as you could. Despite those best efforts, you might still see a case, but at least you're able to demonstrate to OSHA, to a state Department of Health, and perhaps in litigation, that you did the best you could to provide a safe workplace. Now you're going to get requests for accommodations from certain employees. Those accommodations are going to span the gamut from remote work arrangements to staggered shifts to basically accommodations within a manufacturing environment that are going to vary. Whatever they are, is really important, I think, for the employer to document those decisions. When did you get the request? How was it evaluated, and what happened? What did you do? What was the result of it? this is going back to what I said before about being able to demonstrate that you were, you were responding in a uniform way. You want to avoid discrimination charges. This is really important to do that. You're going to want to be able to demonstrate that you applied the same rules uniformly across the workforce without regard to whatever protected categories certain employees might find themselves in. So again, documenting that you were uniform and consistent across the board is really important. Take notes, make records about what you did, how you made those decisions. Keep in mind that those records are probably not going to be privileged. They're not. They may be discovery in a piece of litigation that arises, but at least you'll be able to use them and document what your process was. And be really careful about the reopening plans. Think about the rules that we're talking about today and document what that reopening plan is. Putting it down on paper, I think, is very important in these situations. So let's talk about how we're going to protect employees and how you're going to provide a safe workplace. Safety first, of course, should be your number one focus. What we need to make sure we're also doing is enforcing your anti-retaliation policy to protect whistleblowers. That is, people who raise their hand and complain or raise a concern about what's being done in the workplace. You should consider folks that do raise their hands or do have suggestions or do have complaints as possible whistleblowers. If they're not treated appropriately, that would be the number one thing I would think about as a plaintiff's lawyer in terms of how I represent them. If for example, you've laid them off, you've demoted them or terminated them for some reason. So again, making sure that your policy of anti-retaliation is in place and it is applied uniformly around the organization. This goes back to what I said a moment ago about documentation. When someone raises their hand and reports a concern or an issue, I highly recommend that you treat every single one of them as a possible as something that needs to be taken care of, that needs to be investigated, and treated as a possible whistleblowing claim. So your policy should be non-discriminatory in terms of how you apply these standards. The CDC guidelines we've talked about a moment ago. The temperature checks is an issue that comes up quite a bit. Are you required to do a temperature check? Are you not? The answer there is that it's recommended that you have employees either check their own temperatures on a daily basis before they come back to work, or that you provide some sort of a temperature check device in the workplace. We talked about density rules earlier. Density rules, I think, are very important. Again, trying to demonstrate that you've done as much as you could to de-densify the workplace and be able to document that is important. Investigate every complaint like we talked about a moment ago. Now, when I talk about investigation of these complaints, I don't mean that we have to necessarily retain counsel and treat it like it's a federal case. But I think you have to be able to demonstrate that you ran down every one of these complaints and you treated them seriously. What exactly that means is going to depend on the nature of the complaint, but be able to demonstrate that you did that. And then there's a combination of things I would suggest, like minimizing or preventing outside visitors for the time being, the self-screening and documentation we talked about a moment ago, having employees be able to screen their own health conditions and report that they are not COVID positive and have not been exposed to COVID in the recent past before they show up at the office. And there's an OSHA poster out there. There may be state equivalents as well, but it pertains directly to COVID. Just keep in mind, by the way, that there's 30 states that are now requiring COVID-19 preparedness plans for outbreaks. That is to have a site plan with hygiene practices, mask protocols, physical distancing, also a plan about what happens when an outbreak occurs, like we talked about a moment ago. Some of them are industry specific, like in California and New Hampshire, for example. And then lastly, training has got to be part of that program as well. Training employees about what's expected of them, how do they function in the workplace, what's expected of them from the perspective of PPE use, et cetera. Also, too, I want to just talk a little bit about your exposure here from a liability standpoint. If you don't do these kinds of things, if you don't get serious about providing a safe workplace, the exposure that the company has to liability is that you are not going to be able to demonstrate that a case of COVID that an employee experiences is not related to your workplace. What I mean by that is if you don't do what CDC recommends and you don't provide a safe workplace, you are not going to be able to overcome a claim that by an employee that he or she got sick in the workplace or was exposed to COVID in the workplace and got sick as a result. All right. So here's what happens when an employee gets COVID-19. As I said before, send the employee home to quarantine for at least 10 days. 14 days has been talked about by CDC in the past, but the more recent standards talk about a 10-day quarantine period. Vacate the premises, clean the areas where the COVID-19 case, vacate the premises and clean the areas where the employee that showed the positive COVID-19 diagnosis did work. It's going to require a little bit of investigation to determine where that would be. In many cases, unfortunately, it may be that you clean your entire office. Contact tracing is really important to be able to notify potentially exposed coworkers that there was a COVID-19 case. They may have been exposed and they should perhaps get tested and quarantined. The important thing here is do not identify the sick employee, though. Do not identify that person by name. You can just say that there was a COVID-19 case and there was a possible exposure, but you're not required to, and in fact, you're prohibited from identifying the name. Whether or not the coworkers can figure it out by themselves or through a process of elimination does not matter. It's what is the employer permitted to do. You're not permitted to identify the person by name. Air out the premises if you can. Determine a return to work date in accordance with the CDC guidelines. And there may be cases in which you record the infection and report it to OSHA. I'm not saying that you necessarily have to, but OSHA's got standards in terms of whether the case is going to be associated with a workplace. So it's basically reportable to OSHA if it's a confirmed illness, it's absolutely work-related under the regulations, and then there's also general reporting criteria. If anybody's interested, the regulation is 29 CFR 1904.5 and .7. All right.
Hey, Chris, this is everyone. Thank you for participating and listening. And this is Anthony Davis. I'm one of the partners at the firm. Chris, there's a couple of questions in the Q&A that some of the attendees are posting. One is that I thought you might want to answer now since you just covered it, but it's a good question. As part of layoffs done for necessary downsizing, what needs to be done to protect against perceived medical discrimination, sort of in essence, at-risk employees?
That's a great question. It goes back to what I said earlier about a risk analysis. When we do a risk analysis, we want to know all of the factors that apply to the impacted employees. It's not to say we're necessarily going to change our decision about who's impacted, but we at least want to know whether there are any risk factors, that is, factors about the particular employees that put themselves in a protected category. So, and we also want to be able to demonstrate that those factors were not the reasons why people were selected. So it's all about doing that risk analysis and being able to document how the decisions were made, and just logically you'll be able to demonstrate that the health conditions were not the reasons why the particular employees were chosen. Hopefully they're going to be chosen on some other basis like skill set, seniority, for example. But again, it's all about being able to demonstrate the real reasons for the selections. Tony, did you have another question that we wanted to hit before we go ahead?
Yeah, actually, there was a follow-up to that one, which is another good question. What requirement do we have related to, or do employers have related to compensating the sick employee? And what is the process for bringing them back after a COVID diagnosis?
Another great question. So in terms of compensation, they are going to, if you have an employee that becomes COVID-19 positive, they are going to be eligible to use, first of all, any accrued and unused sick time. And, the amount of sick time that they should be afforded is going to depend on your local jurisdiction. Some places like New Jersey, for example, have a minimum paid sick leave statute that requires the employer to provide at least 5 days of sick time. So they would use any accrued and unused sick. You may want to allow them to use any accrued and unused vacation pay potentially, even though that might be an exception to your policy, just in the name of trying to accommodate these folks. There's also under the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, the FFCRA, there's also emergency sick leave for COVID cases up to 80 hours that the employer can or should provide if they're a covered employer, and the employer would basically get reimbursed for that paid sick leave as a credit on their taxes. It's basically a tax credit reimbursement. So you would be able to get that as an employer back on a quarterly basis in your returns. You would take it as a credit. That's typically where we see it, in terms of the compensation. Once that leave is exhausted, hopefully folks are recovering within that period of time. You're talking about maybe as much as 3 weeks plus any vacation that's accrued and unused. So hopefully, what we've seen anyways, in the majority of cases, employees are recovering before they exhaust that leave. After that, though, there's no requirement of paid sick or compensation. They're going to go into an FMLA type situation. The federal FMLA statute, if your company is covered, requires that the employer to provide 12 weeks of protected but unpaid leave. So FMLA may kick in depending on whether your company is covered. And then there may be certain statutes at the state level that provide additional benefits in that area, but it all falls in the category of an FMLA type leave at that point. Okay. Okay to go on, Tony?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah.
Great. So COVID-19 diagnosis impacts. Questions come up, in the legal press anyway, about whether a COVID-19 diagnosis is by itself or, in and of itself, a disability under the ADA. That's the Americans with Disabilities Act. There's been no, appellate decisions on that issue, but I think it's safe to say that just having a diagnosis of COVID-19 is probably not a disability in and of itself. That's not to say that somebody can be necessarily terminated for it or not hired because they had a positive diagnosis and it's been resolved. But in and of itself, the COVID-19 diagnosis, I predict, is not going to be an ADA disability that requires accommodation. Now, if somebody has lasting effects from COVID-19, lasting physical impacts, those conditions may rise to the level of an ADA disability that needs to be accommodated. All right, so keep that in mind as you're dealing with your employees. Think about it in a timeline. Somebody has a diagnosis, deal with the diagnosis. Let's understand whether there's any lasting impacts beyond the initial diagnosis, and then treat those as potential disabilities under ADA. Time off is something that we just covered a moment ago in terms of paid sick leave. But when you think about flexibility and how you're dealing with your employees, I tell employers, within reason, extending time off to employees who need it is a really good way to deal with a lot of these issues. Certainly in terms of recovering from an illness, time off, even if it's unpaid, is very helpful in many cases. Even somebody who's got a fear of COVID, I think, based on what you see in the news, it's not unrealistic to think that many people are a little bit afraid about leaving their home and coming to work. So, you would want to do your best to coax them back to the workplace and assure them that you're doing everything you can in terms of safety. But providing people with a little flexibility and a little time off is going to go a long way to kind of reassuring people and making them feel a little bit more comfortable about coming back to the workplace. And that's, that's without regard to whether you're covered by FMLA. We just covered that a moment ago. And as I said before, this is really important. Don't terminate someone based on the COVID-19 diagnosis alone. Whether or not they're going to have any lasting effects or impacts from COVID-19 is going to come out and remain to be seen later, but don't terminate them on that basis alone. Because I think that's gonna potentially put you in a claim situation. So paid sick leave under the Family First Coronavirus Response Act. We just really talked about that a second ago, but I want to get a little more specific about a couple of things. Number one, where childcare, childcare facilities or schools are closed, or there's a hybrid learning environment in place, the FFCRA may provide you as an employee with benefits. It may entitle you to some of the sick leave benefits. An issue that was clarified recently, I think within the last 2 weeks, though, is if a child has the option either to do remote learning or go back to school and attend school live, if there's an option, then the employee is not entitled to collect benefits, not entitled to take advantage of the sick leave. It's only where the closure is mandatory and the remote learning is mandatory. So keep that in mind. And then the FMLA leave we talked about a moment ago, the FMLA entitlement is going to resume after a furlough is resolved. Keep in mind here too, retaliation. I keep talking about retaliation. When you talk about retaliation against a potential whistleblower, that is perhaps one of the sexier claims for a plaintiff's lawyer, because many statutes at the state level would entitle a plaintiff to recover attorney's fees and punitive damages and all kinds of bad stuff for the employer. So that I just want to reiterate here, that's why it's really important to make sure that you're keeping your anti-retaliation policy in mind and treating people as fairly as you possibly can when they raise these issues and when they make requests for paid sick leave. And there was some guidance from the U.S. Department of Labor on this FMLA issue. So if somebody were on an extended FMLA period but did not exhaust the FMLA leave before the COVID leave starts, before the COVID furlough starts, you're basically going to see, so in the timeline, you would see the FMLA leave starts, let's say it's for 2 weeks, and then there was a COVID furlough in the middle. At the end of the furlough, if there's additional FMLA leave that's required, the FMLA leave restarts at the end of the furlough. So in my example, the employee is entitled to another 10 weeks of FMLA leave after the furlough. So keep that in mind. That's July 20th guidance from the U.S. Department of Labor. Now, just a practice pointer there, if you're in a furlough situation at your company, what you may think about doing is think about if you've got multiple people on an FMLA leave, you may think about timing your furlough to start after that FMLA leave expires, if you can. So returning to work after COVID-19, this is where the rules get a little bit interesting. So number one, you can require somebody who has a COVID-19 diagnosis to undergo a medical exam and get certified to return to work. That is, to get certified that they're no longer contagious. This would not have been possible before COVID-19. To require a medical exam like this would be generally not permitted unless it were directly related to the skills of a job. In this case, though, because of the serious nature of COVID and the way it's spread, you can require somebody who had a COVID-19 diagnosis to get certified before they come back. On the other hand, you cannot require somebody to get the antibody testing. Exactly why there's a distinction there in terms of the guidance is a little bit unclear, but suffice it to say that the name of the game is preventing further spread in the workplace, and that's where the medical exam and the certification come in. There's no real correlation between the presence of antibodies in someone's blood and the safety issue in the workplace. So medical exam is okay, antibody testing is not. Again, we just talking about accommodations here. If somebody reports that post-COVID they've got breathing issues or other physical issues, that's going to trigger an obligation to talk about accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So keep that in mind. Go through your normal ADA process, And if you've got a vendor that does that for your company, you're going to direct your employees to contact the vendor and assist them with that process. And treating everybody the same here is really, really important. Again, I can't stress enough how not being non-discriminatory in terms of how you carry this out is going to be critical. Now, this is going to get a little fact specific. So to do that ADA analysis, or to figure out exactly how people are going to come back to work in a safe way, is going to depend a bit on your particular work environment. So that's where you're going to need some assistance potentially, maybe from your counsel and certainly from your HR team. Couple of issues here. Again, this is where it gets a little bit different from how it was before COVID. We've seen a number of times with our clients where employees report a fear of coming to work because they live with persons, maybe older relatives or relatives who are sick or find themselves in a higher risk population. So they've got a generalized fear of contracting the illness. What we've been telling employers here is, I would address these employees as if they themselves are high-risk employees and treat them appropriately. So if we can make an accommodation and let somebody work remotely, not come back into the workplace, no matter how serious you are about providing a safe and clean workplace, I would encourage you to do that. Because I don't think it serves anybody's purposes to drag people back into the office when they've got legitimate fears. Now that's compared to a generalized concern where people just are expressing some concern about leaving the house and coming back to work because of the possibility of acquiring or contracting the disease. That's going to be a bit of a different situation, also fact specific. I think you're going to give that less credence than you would somebody who's got a legitimate concern because they live with somebody in a high risk category, or certainly they find themselves in a high risk category. But I would also encourage you to be as flexible as you can within reason, because again, there is some concern out there about just moving about and whether you might contract the disease. I'm not telling you that you have to let every person who has a generalized concern work from home, but I would encourage you to be as flexible as you can within reason. And then after that, you rely upon your disability accommodation process, and whether there's whether you're going to send them to your contractor, the outsourced solution who does your ADA analysis. If you can't coax people back to work and assure them that you're doing the best you can to provide a safe workplace, you could send them right through your ADA process, and the ADA vendor that you use will make the determination about whether they're entitled to an accommodation or not, and that will at least empower you to make a determination. If you can't coax them back to work, and they don't qualify for an ADA analysis, and there's no other flexibility that you can provide, that ADA process will at least give you the justification for denying the request for an accommodation. So that's where the process is going to be important. Some issues about applicants who have COVID-19 symptoms. So we've been talking a lot about employees. Now we're going to talk about applicants. There's certainly ADA issues in terms of, how do you accommodate an applicant's, concern, disability that arose from a COVID-19 diagnosis or a COVID-19 situation. That's a little bit separate. You're going to use your typical ADA process for that. But based on guidance from the Department of Labor, the ADA would permit, first of all, post-offer medical exams. So you go through an interview process, you issue an offer, extend an offer. If somebody had a COVID-19 diagnosis, you can require them to get certified just as you would a returning employee. Make sure that this process applies to all your applicants. Again, you want to treat everybody the same. And then lastly, if you have a very time-sensitive job offer, you can retract that offer or delay a job offer based on someone's reported COVID-19 symptoms. So I think you would have been in a difficult situation to do that pre-COVID. But when it comes to COVID, the name of the game is keeping your workplace safe and preventing the spread. And therefore, again, this is based on Department of Labor guidance at the federal level. You could retract or delay a job offer based on those symptoms, or certainly a COVID-19 diagnosis. If you're going to do that, though, I would encourage you to be able to demonstrate why you did it. Again, what we want to do just from an exposure standpoint is minimize your exposure to claims in the future if someone were inclined to do that. So be able to document why you had a time-sensitive position, what was so important about it, and why you made the decision to retract or delay an offer. Remote employees, a lot of talk about it, obviously, because so many employers had to pivot. First of all, there are some emergency exceptions noted. When you make an exception to your normal policy about remote work, I think you need to document that there were emergency circumstances so that when the COVID-19 pandemic is over, you can return to your normal policy. But in terms of how you figure out who can work and when, who's eligible and who's not, you need to determine it as equitably as you can and administer your policy, your program in a non-discriminatory manner. Again, this goes back to what I said before, document how you decided people's requests for remote work. If you don't have a policy, you should have one, but if you're gonna use an existing policy, make sure that it indicates you can amend or eliminate the remote work situation in any time you want. You have to be prepared to explain why you made certain decisions again, but you should also have flexibility to pull it back whenever you want as well, assuming that you can accommodate all of the things we talked about before in terms of a safe workplace. I've had a number of clients who come to me and say, look, I have somebody working remotely. I don't think they're being as productive as they should be. I want to pull them back to the office and basically, put the hammer down on these people. What I've told them is that it doesn't really serve the purpose of increasing productivity just to drag them back to the office and cancel their remote work situation. What I would encourage you to do is deal with your performance problems as you would normally, deal with those issues, and then decide on your remote work arrangements separately. Really divide the two. The two issues don't really fit together so well. If you have somebody who's being unproductive, deal with that in some way. Require them to do things to demonstrate the productivity, maybe help accommodate them as best they can, because you're going to find some people don't really have a conducive work environment at home for a variety of reasons, but deal with that separately. And then, manage performance, and then deal with your remote work completely separately. You may decide you're going to lay somebody off or terminate them based on the lack of performance, but that should be a separate analysis, in my opinion. Also, about remote employees, there are Fair Labor Standards Act issues. What we find, I think, is that folks are working longer in some cases than they normally would. I don't know if that's a function of just being stuck at home with nothing to do, whatever it is. If you know as an employer that you have an employee who didn't work, beyond the standard 8 hours a day, if they actually perform the work, you have to pay them for it if they are non-exempt people. So if they're entitled to overtime, they have to be compensated appropriately, even if it's against policy. Now, you can deal with it after the fact and sort of reprimand folks for working beyond their normal workday and working overtime hours. But if you know what the work was done, and you're looking at it in the past, you need to make sure that they get paid appropriately. But have policies in place about off hours work and enforce it. So, but if the work was done, you got to pay for it. You may want to remind employees that they're still entitled to their normal meal and rest breaks. Again, this is for non-exempt folks. So they're still entitled to those things, even though they're working from home, even though they're not experiencing a daily commute, they're working, in their apartments or in their homes, they're still entitled to those breaks. You can require time reporting as a policy for all employees if you want. The employer should provide a system for doing that, but you can certainly require it. There's a lot of technology solutions out there to get that done. And as I said earlier in the presentation, there are many childcare and homeschooling issues that folks are trying to balance the fact that their kids are home, or maybe they've got other relatives, other cohabitants home, and they're trying to balance all those issues. This is, again, the time to be as flexible as you possibly can. Remember, too, that, this thing is going to end eventually. And many of us, not all of us, but many of us are going to go back into a more normal work environment, or a more normal pre-COVID work environment. So again, some of this flexibility is going to go a long way to keeping people as happy and productive as they possibly can during a period that I think is challenging for all of us. Once the emergency is over, it's time to look at those policies that you have. And I think, we're going to learn a lot, if we haven't already, about, how to manage people in a remote work environment. But this is something that you ought to be thinking about. You don't have to wait until the pandemic is over, by the way, to update your policy and publish a new one. But take the learning that you've experienced and make sure that your policies really reflect this new normal, if you will, that we have. You can certainly mandate where employees do their remote work. So, for example, if you want to have a policy which says, you don't want people working in a coffee shop because you have concerns about trade secrets, or you've got concerns about confidentiality, for example, you can tell employees that they can't work in certain places. By the way, you should also know that OSHA requirements still apply. So even if somebody's working remotely, you want to ensure that they're in a safe environment and that it's conducive to the work that they're doing. They're still covered for purposes of workers' compensation. They're still entitled to benefits. California is the first state that I'm aware of, anyway, that mandates the payment of home office expenses. But you as an employer may want to have a policy in place to determine who gets paid what in terms of their home office expenses. Again, don't assume that everybody is doing better than they were before just because they don't have to pay for commuting expenses. It could be expensive to buy office supplies, toner cartridges, etc., even home office equipment. So what I would tell you is, what's your policy? Have a policy in place and apply it uniformly. You may want to reimburse employees for some of these, and in some cases, like in California, you're going to be required to do it. And then lastly, updating your policies and your training for this new remote work environment. You still should be doing your anti-harassment training and all the other types of training that you're delivering to your employees. Maybe you're doing, and you should be doing, code of conduct training or compliance training. Make sure that you do that, and make sure that your policies and your systems enable you to do that in a remote environment. When it comes to compliance and ethics, your reporting mechanism needs to reflect the fact that you may have remote workers now too. So make sure that your systems do provide for that. Just in terms of what does OSHA require, again, you have a duty to provide a safe workplace. It still applies to remote workers. What that specifically means is that the workplace should be free from recognized hazards. You want to encourage employees to review their work areas and minimize those hazards, like trip hazards, like making sure that they are in an environment in which they can be productive and also not hurt themselves. And what we're seeing a lot of, I think, are reports about carpal tunnel syndrome, other repetitive stress injuries. So I think as an employer, for purposes of minimizing your workers' comp exposure, I think you're going to want to take those things into account. And again, get people the tools that they need to be productive as well as stay safe. This is the last issue that I want to cover, but it's certainly not the least issue. Confidentiality and cybersecurity. This is a huge issue now that so many folks are working remotely. Why is it a problem? Well, people are working in a remote environment in a place that they might not otherwise be as diligent about cybersecurity. Maybe they're working on equipment that's not that doesn't include the latest protection against viruses and phishing scams and all of the things that you might be doing a better job of in the workplace. Their guard is down, quite frankly, and people are stressed a little bit more than they normally might be. So they may not be as wary about phishing attempts that they receive on their email. Maybe they're checking personal email. Maybe they're using an outdated laptop that's on an old version of Windows and doesn't have all the protections that their desktop computer did. It's a combination of things that really create a recipe for potential disaster. So you got to be really vigilant. You got to remind folks that whatever confidentiality rules applied in the workplace certainly apply in the remote environment. Your IT folks have to be particularly diligent to make sure that cybersecurity is top of mind for your employees, that they need to provide, that they need to protect trade secrets. Uh, don't allow employees to do risky workarounds to get their work done. Give them the tools that they need, and make sure that the equipment they're using is up to standard, uh, and is not going to create a risk that would, you know, be worse than the money savings that you're experiencing just by not giving them the right equipment. It is a burden on IT resources for sure, but now is the time to make sure that folks are well equipped. I know it's easier said than done because this could be pretty expensive for a company, but I think in many cases the exposure that you're going to prevent is going to be a lot more or a lot bigger than the cost that you're going to sustain. When it comes to training, I think now, if you haven't already done it, now is the time to think about training employees on what to avoid, what to be aware of, to avoid phishing emails. Teach them what it's like to, or teach them what they should be looking for in terms of these scam emails that are going to come across their not only their Gmail and their personal emails, but also their work emails. There's been an uptick in activity in this area. FBI has reported a lot about it, as well as the Department of Homeland Security and others. So it's out there. People are trying to take advantage of the situation where people are working at home, and again, not as diligent as they should be. So provide that training. When it comes to monitoring, though, a question has come up not with our clients as well as in the popular press. Should you electronically monitor your employees? Should you put software on their laptops or on their iPads to track what they're doing on a daily basis or a minute by minute basis in some cases? I highly recommend that companies have in place an IT policy, which will inform employees about what they can and can't do on your company equipment and systems. We'll talk about whether there's an expectation of privacy in those devices and in the work that they generate on those systems. And that's fine. But in terms of monitoring people, turning on their cameras or imposing or putting software on their devices that tracks what they do, what keystrokes they make, I think that's going to be, it's a real potential quagmire, in my opinion. It's going to clash with some expectations of privacy that people have in their home environment. So before you start monitoring your employees, I think that's going to be a very case-specific analysis that you're going to want to do, not only with your HR team, but also with your legal counsel, to be sure that you're, number one, not going to violate any state and federal privacy regulations. And number two, that you do it in an informed way, and you also announce it to your employees to make sure that they understand that they're going to be monitored. I would default to the answer of no about whether you should do this, unless you do that very specific analysis. So don't do it unless you do that analysis and determine A, that it's legal, and B, that your employees understand what it all means to them on a day by day basis. And then video conferencing is another place. Everybody is using Microsoft Teams or Zoom or WebEx and others to do video conferences. The question is going to be whether you record those conferences. If you do it, number one, do the analysis I just talked about in terms of electronic monitoring, and then secondly, make sure that employees understand that the calls are going to be taped. And then lastly, your records retention policy should be updated to reflect the fact that you're now creating these records in the form of videotapes of your Zoom conferences and others. So be sure that you're going to retain them according to whatever your policy is. So that's it for the prepared material that we had today. I have to say that this is a big collection of pretty complex stuff. It's very case specific, very client specific sometimes, and it represents a big departure in some cases from what we knew to be the rules before COVID-19. So it's a lot to absorb, it's a lot to handle, and your particular return to work policy is going to be very specific, or should be very specific to your workplace and your industry. So I would encourage anybody who's joined us for today's webinar to give us a call or set up an appointment. In fact, we're going to have our team just reach out to you folks to see what you thought about the program, as well as find out whether you've got any questions that you want to talk about. And we're happy to answer as many of those questions as we can, just to continue the dialogue and make sure that you've got all of the information that you need to create your own plan. And we're happy to partner with all of you to develop those plans as best we can.
Chris, thank you again. This is Tony. Thank you again. That was an excellent presentation. And I'm glad you highlighted the fact that, this really is a product of all the various issues that we're helping clients with and addressing as, all these challenges arise. There was a handful of questions that people asked, and I just want to be mindful of everyone's time. You answered a few of them. I think some will answer the very specific questions that have come in the Q&A, and we'll reach out to people and answer those questions directly, or you can reach out to us and answer directly. But I want to be mindful of everyone's time. But thanks, Chris. That was an excellent presentation, and appreciate it. As Chris said, we're happy to help anyone with formulating their plans or answering any of these challenging questions that everyone's dealing with. Yeah, you're not alone. There's lots of questions as this crisis develops, evolves, and everyone's trying to get back to work and provide a safe and healthy work environment for everyone in their company, and trying to navigate everything. So appreciate you listening in, and look forward to talking to some of you to help you with any return to work issues.
Yeah, we had a couple of questions that I'm seeing that I could just answer really quickly since we have a couple of moments.
Oh, fine. Okay.
Because if you have a non-exempt employee working remotely and they're required to go to work for part of the day, will they be paid for their time commuting to work? Generally, they would not be eligible to get paid for their commuting time. So, but it depends, if they're going to do some work during the commute, perhaps, or they're going to go from one facility to the next, there may be certain instances in which they are eligible to be paid, but generally they don't get paid for the commute. And I think we covered the other question about, is it legal to add software to an employee's home computer? In the last slide there, the answer is that if you're going to do that, you should have an agreement with the employee about what that means for them, and then so that they understand exactly what's happening, in terms of what kind of monitoring there is or what kind of impact there would be by doing that to their home environment. Okay. As Tony said, though, we're going to reach out to everybody to see if you have other questions that we can answer, and we'll set up some phone calls to get those done. But it looks like we're just coming up on the hour. So again, thank you so much for spending time with us today, and we look forward to partnering with you and helping you through these difficult times. That'll be the end of our presentation for today.